and from these repressed fragments, the shadow grows. This is why the empath often finds themselves suddenly overwhelmed by emotions that seem disproportionate to the moment. It is not the present offense alone that wounds them. It is the cumulative eruption of 1,000 small humiliations, each one denied expression, now demanding recognition in a flood. The ending of patience is never a sudden act. It is the breaking of a dam that has long been under unseen pressure. Disrespect is not merely a social failing. It is a psychic assault. To be disrespected is to be denied recognition of your individuality, to be treated as if your existence is less than whole. For the empath, whose identity is entwined with the recognition of others, this denial cuts doubly deep. They live by resonance, by feeling the currents of another's soul. And when those currents return disdain or indifference, NCE, the empath is cast into disorientation. They ask themselves, did I imagine this? Did I create the very disrespect I am now enduring? This reflexive self-doubt is the wound of the feminine principle within us all that seeks affirmation through relationship. And yet I must insist, disrespect is real, and it must be confronted, not absorbed like a toxin you believe you are destined to neutralize. You see, the archetype of the empath is closely bound to that of the wounded healer. It is no coincidence that those who feel most deeply are often those who were wounded earliest. The empath's capacity for patience, for bearing the unbearable, originates not in innate virtue, but in survival. As children, they endured disrespect in silence, for to speak out was to risk abandonment, and abandonment to the child's psyche is equivalent to death. Thus, patience became armor and silence became strategy. But armor worn too long fuses with the skin, and strategies of survival calcify into identity, ides. The empath begins to believe they are patience incarnate, forgetting that beneath the armor lies a soul yearning not merely to endure, but to be honored. Dreams often betray this truth. An empath may dream of being trapped in a house that is not their own, surrounded by voices that demand attention yet never listen in return. They may find themselves holding water in a sieve, endlessly pouring themselves out while never retaining nourishment. These dreams are not random. They are symbols of the psychic imbalance that results when patience is divorced from boundary. The sieve is the empath's energy leaking without containment. The house is the collective psyche of others in which the empath is imprisoned. Only when such dreams are confronted with conscious reflection can the empath begin to see that their endurance is not divinity but compulsion, not grace, but repetition of trauma. Now, when patience ends, what emerges is often shocking to the empath themselves. Anger raw and volcanic surges through the carefully maintained surface. And here lies a paradox. The anger is not pathology but medicine. It is the voice of the shadow, the guardian of dignity, finally breaking through the repression that has silenced it for so long. But because the empath has disowned anger, believing it to be unworthy of their gentle nature, they experience it as alien, even demonic. They say, "This is not me. I am not the one who burns with fury," and yet it is precisely them. It is the energy that has waited in exile to demand respect where patience alone has failed. The task, therefore, is not to banish anger, but to integrate it. To see that disrespect cannot always be transformed by endurance. Sometimes it must be met by the fierce assertion of one's worth. In alchemical terms, the blackness of anger is the negredo, the dark stage that precedes transformation. Out of that black soil, the gold of individuation can be born. The empath must descend into this darkness, into their own rage, not to be consumed by it, but to reclaim it as their rightful power. For in the unconscious lies the archetype of the warrior, and even the gentlest soul must awaken it when dignity is under siege. Consider how the archetype of Christ has been distorted in this regard. We see him as the lamb who endured insult and injury without protest, and indeed this is true. But we forget the Christ who overturned the tables in the temple, who with righteous fury expelled the money changers. The empath remembers only the lamb and represses the lion, and thus they become sacrificial victims in the temple of disrespect. Yet wholeness demands both. To handle disrespect is not merely to forgive. It is also to know when to assert, when to draw the line, when to declare, no more. The true Christ image contains both sacrifice and sovereignty, both patience and the power to confront. I say to you, the ending of patience is not the end of empathy. It is the rebirth of empathy into maturity. To endure disrespect endlessly is to betray the self, and betrayal of the self is the deepest wound of all. When patience ends, the empath is given an opportunity to encounter their shadow, to see in its fury the guardian of their integrity. This is not weakness, this is individuation. And individuation is always born from tension between light and dark, between endurance and rebellion, between compassion and self-respect. Only by holding these opposites without collapsing into either extreme does the soul grow whole. The challenge, however, is that when the empath first encounters disrespect with newfound courage, they are accused of being cruel, selfish, or changed for the worse. Those who have benefited from their endless patience are unsettled by the shift. The empath must resist the temptation to retreat, to apologize for the strength of their voice. This is the initiation to withstand not only the disrespect but the backlash that comes when one no longer consents to it. In the hat crucible, the empath discovers that true patience is not passive endurance but conscious choice. It is no longer the patience of the child surviving neglect, but the patience of the adult who knows their worth and chooses carefully when to give and when to withhold. Thus, the guide I offer you is not a set of rules, but a call to awakening. When your patience ends, it is not failure. It is the soul insisting that you honor the archetype of dignity. Handling disrespect is not about retaliation, nor about eternal tolerance. It is about integration. To meet it with silence is repression. To meet it with violence is shadow uncontained. But to meet it with clear and grounded assertion, that is individuation. That is the emergence of the self, and in that moment, the empath ceases to be merely a wounded healer repeating their childhood script. They become a whole person, luminous yet rooted, compassionate yet unyielding, finally at peace with both their light and their shadow. When tension has ended and the voice of the shadow begins to rise, the empath encounters a fork in the psychic path. One road leads back into repression, where they attempt to reclothe themselves in silence, convincing the world and themselves that their eruption was a mistake, that anger has no place in the temple of empathy. The other road, however, leads into the forest of individuation, where one must confront the wild animals of the unconscious, the dream figures who embody the very qualities long denied. It is not enough to speak of boundaries in the abstract. They must be experienced in the soul, seen in dreams, felt in the body, and enacted in life, for the psyche will not tolerate an endless cycle of self-sacrifice. The unconscious, like a neglected god, eventually demands to be honored. In the language of dreams, disrespect often appears as figures who mock, belittle, or ignore the dreamer. The dreamer may find themselves naked in a crowd, their voice drowned out by laughter, or struggling to defend themselves while their words turn to dust. These dreams are not punishments but revelations. They unveil the truth that the ego has abandoned its throne, leaving the kingdom of the self vulnerable to invasion. The empath who accepts disrespect without protest has, in symbolic terms, left their crown unattended, and what is unattended in the psyche becomes possessed by shadow. The mocking dream figures are not merely external aggressors. They are the internalized voices of those who once disrespected the dreamer, voices now animated in the unconscious, until they are faced with awareness. I have seen patients whose entire demeanor was that of bowed shoulders, quiet eyes, and a voice that trailed off before completing a sentence. They were the embodiment of patience but also of invisibility, and invisibility is the soil in which disrespect flourishes. When one does not claim their full presence, others will unconsciously sense the absence and treat it as permission to diminish. This is not cruelty alone. It is the psychic law that what is unclaimed within will be projected without. The empath, by refusing to own their power, attracts those who would abuse it not as cosmic punishment, but as a mirror, as an invitation to see what has been lost in themselves. Let us speak of archetypes, for archetypes are the eternal patterns through which human life is lived. The empath resonates with the archetype of the great mother, the nurturer who gives without end, who gathers the wounded to her breast and holds their suffering. But the great mother has two faces. One is nurturing, but the other is devouring. If the empath refuses to set boundaries, they unconsciously invoke the devouring aspect not against others, but against themselves. They become consumed by their own giving, hollowed out by patience turned into martyrdom. To remain only in the light phase of the archetype is to court destruction. One must integrate the darker face to say, I give, because I choose, but I will not give when it violates my soul. In this way, the archetype is balanced, and the empath emerges not as victim but as sovereign caretaker of their own psychic energy. Here the role of anger becomes clearer. Anger is the sword of the self. It is not meant to slash indiscriminately, but to cut away what does not belong, to sever ties with what disrespects the dignity of the soul. The empath who disowns anger disowns their sword, and thus they remain defenseless in a world that does not always honor gentleness. To reclaim anger is not to become cruel, but to rediscover the capacity for protection. In myth, every nurturing goddess has her warrior counterpart: Isis, who heals but also commands spells of fierce banishment; Kali, who embraces but also destroys illusion; Mary, who is tender but also crushes the serpent underfoot. The empath must recognize this duality, that love without power is incomplete, and power without love is tyranny. True individuation demands the marriage of both. Disrespect, then, becomes a teacher. It arrives like an unwelcome visitor, but it carries the gift of revelation. It forces the empath to see where they have abandoned themselves, where they have mistaken tolerance for transformation. When the soul is disrespected, a fire is lit in the unconscious, and this fire can either burn destructively or illuminate the path to wholeness. The choice lies in whether the empath turns inward to confront the shadow, or outward to merely reenact the same pattern. To turn inward is to ask, why does this wound pierce me so deeply? What in me has agreed to carry this weight? These questions do not absolve the offender, but they liberate the empath from endless repetition. For one cannot control the actions of others, but one can awaken to the archetypes that rule within. In the seminar halls of the psyche, I often hear the cry, but if I confront disrespect, will I not become what I despise? Will I not lose my empathy? This ears are understandable, for the empath identifies so completely with patience that they see any act of self-assertion as betrayal. But this is illusion. To assert oneself is not to abandon empathy. It is to give empathy a firm foundation. Only when the vessel is intact can it hold water. Only when the empath honors themselves can they truly honor others. Otherwise, their giving is but a disguised plea for recognition, a silent hope that their endurance will finally earn respect. Yet respect cannot be earned through denial of the self. It must be claimed through presence of the self. Notice how the psyche communicates through symbols. A patient once dreamed of carrying a fragile bird in their hands, protecting it from storms, feeding it crumbs from their own mouth. Yet in the dream, the bird never grew stronger, never flew. The patient awoke exhausted, realizing that their care had become captivity. This is the empath's dilemma: to protect so completely that the other never learns to lie, while the self grows weary from endless sacrifice. The dream revealed the shadow truth. Their patience was not love but fear. The fear that without their endurance, they would no longer be needed. This is the secret wound of the empath. Patience as a disguise for terror of abandonment. When patience ends, this terror must be faced, and only by facing it does one discover that the soul does not depend on being endlessly needed, but on being authentically respected. The end of patience, therefore, is not collapse but initiation. It is the threshold where the empath ceases to be child and becomes adult in the psyche. The child endures disrespect because survival depends upon it. The adult confronts disrespect because dignity demands it. This transition is terrifying, for it feels like death, the death of the old identity, the death of the persona that was always agreeable, always kind, always the vessel of others' needs. Yet in Jungian psychology, death is always the prelude to rebirth. RTH. The empath who dares to let their patients die is reborn into wholeness. They are no longer merely the healer. They become the integrated being who can nurture and protect, endure and resist, love and demand love in return. When you next encounter disrespect, I invite you to see it not merely as insult but as mirror. It reflects the part of you that still hides your crown, that still doubts your worth, that still fears the power of your shadow. To handle it wisely is to stand tall in that moment, to let the voice of anger rise without drowning in it, to let the boundaries of selfhood emerge like the walls of a sacred temple. For every soul is a temple, and every temple requires both open doors for welcome and strong walls for protection. Without the walls, the temple collapses into rubble. Without the doors, it suffocates in isolation. To be whole is to hold both. Thus I say again, when the empath's patience ends, it is not failure but fulfillment. It is the psyche demanding company. Lention, the shadow demanding to be seen, the self demanding to be sovereign. You are not abandoning empathy, you are completing it.